it is my solace. It's my church. It's my, to get out on the bike or to go for a run or a walk. That is what keeps me sane.
Welcome to the Case for Conservation podcast. I'm your host, Andre Mardo. This podcast is aimed at exploring and sometimes questioning conventional wisdom in the conservation of nature and biodiversity. And the purpose of that is to build a more robust and credible case for conservation. Today's episode is slightly unusual, though. Stephen Lowe is one of the most remarkable people I know. He's very easy to spot in a crowd because he's a head taller than anyone around him, and he typically wears a naughty grin on his face. He's without a doubt the most athletic and outdoorsy person I know, despite the fact that he has limited use of one arm after a cycling accident as a teenager. But perhaps most of all, it's Steve's enthusiasm for life and for nature that I find noteworthy and worth sharing. So we talk about where enthusiasm comes from, among other things. You can see the rest of the topics on the subject list in the podcast description. Steve is now a high school science teacher in the UK. He started his career in cardiovascular cell biology after getting his PhD in that subject. In between those two mini careers, he spent more than 10 years studying and working in conservation biology, mostly in South Africa. That's where we met in 2004 doing our MSc together in that subject. I started off our discussion asking him how he got involved in cardiovascular research and why he decided to return to university to change direction towards conservation.
When I went to study biology at uni, it was out of a passion really for ecological issues. And then I remember doing courses in ecology and not really realizing at the time that ecology was really a kind of emerging as a science. The techniques that were being honed at the time to make it a more rigorous science were just sort of really growing. There were obviously some really great ecologists out there, but in terms of the field of ecology and how, the sort of statistical analyses and collection methods, etc., were certainly, developing. And I just remember being a little bit frustrated about the fact that it didn't seem a very rigorous science to me. And actually, I think that was more my lack of imagination and sort of seeing where this was going rather than my lecturers, who I think were probably pretty good, actually. Anyway, I just remember feeling frustrated, yet there was also this hugely growing field of molecular biology. And I just remember being blown away about what was going on, almost like the ecology of the cell. Like what was going on inside a cell seemed as fascinating as what was going on outside the cell. Mm-hmm. And I just remember being completely taken with that. And also there was huge amount of opportunity in that, far more so than in ecology at that time. So I remember just sort of almost switching my allegiance to physiology and the molecular biology side of things. And that's where my interest took me. It doesn't mean that I wasn't no longer interested in the ecological side of it, because I always was a sort of birder and what have you. So then I after university, I really wanted to do a science-based project. I wanted to do a research-based project more because that was the one thing I'd managed to do. I wasn't a great student. It was only at university that I sort of really realized what study was. And I realized that I really wanted to do this sort of academia. And so I sort of did a shotgun approach to applying for masters and PhDs. And most of those were in sort of molecular side of things. And from not having any offers, I got a few offers all at once. And then one of them was funded by the British Heart Foundation, and it was looking at cloning and characterizing genes involved in the cardiovascular system. It looked absolutely fascinating, and it is absolutely fascinating, and it is, important work. But I think it was while I was doing that it kind of dawned on me that, yes, of course, there are people who suffer from heart problems that are congenital, or they're born with, or that they develop through all sorts of reasons.
Yeah.
But primarily, heart disease is a lifestyle disease. And it just made me think that actually, and that doesn't mean it's not then worth studying, but it made me realize that actually maybe public medicine is more important there, sort of education about, what's healthy living. That would make a much bigger impact than funding a PhD student to look at a potential drug target, because that's what I really realized would be the application of my research. Obviously, doing basic research, doing science for science sake, is always a fascinating and interesting thing to do. But I think I wanted to do something that actually had some kind of social impact. And it just felt like actually we spend a huge amount of time and resources and justify it in terms of that it's going to be good for someone's health. And actually, if we thought about efficiently putting our time and resources, actually, I think, so many of the diseases that particularly the Western world is stricken with are not communicable diseases, although I'm talking about in the middle of a pandemic. That sounds like a moot point, but actually I think it's still very much
still is,
most people are dying from cancer, heart disease. And a lot of those, certainly not all, but a lot of those are due to lifestyle. And it just sort of made me think where we put our money and why we do that. It almost struck me now, this is a weird analogy and I don't know if this is going to work, but it's almost like, why is it that we spend so much money advertising burgers, but yet we don't spend much money advertising bananas? You can develop a burger and you can market it and advertise it and sell it, and make a lot of money out of it. Whereas, maybe that's not the case with bananas. And that might be a terrible analogy, but it almost seems like we can put our money into something, we can research it, we can develop a drug, we can market it, we can make money out of it, and therefore that's why we do it, rather than actually that's the best thing for either humankind or the world at large. But then after my PhD, I worked in Edinburgh, and then I managed to get a job in South Africa, which is this amazing 10-year period of my life. And I went out there on, I think it was a year, maybe 2-year contract, working on molecular biology again, on programmed cell death, which is like really important issue. But I was also involved in going walking to the botany department, the zoology department. These fascinating people you go walking in the field with, and they'd tell you about what was happening with the rivers and how, basically this beautiful, amazing, super biodiverse place in this little corner of southern Africa was being completely hammered. And there was not really a great reason why we could do it. There were definitely other ways of managing the situation, and there were potential solutions, but there were very few people really working on it, given the scale of the problem. And also there was so much that wasn't known. Before I did the Masters, what made me want to do the Masters, I remember walking into the freshwater research unit, which is headed by an amazing lady called Professor Jenny Day, and meeting some of her students and basically just knocking on the door and saying, look, there's this issue with these invasive fish and they're wiping out all these native fish. People have been telling me about it, but I can't seem to find anyone to explain why this is happening and who's working on it. And I just remember this guy shaking my hand and he said, welcome to the freshwater research unit. And it was just this tiny unit of really dedicated, really interesting people who were tackling these issues that to me seemed of like paramount importance. It was like, no one's there to help the fish. No one's help. They've been evolving there for millions of years and we're about to go extinct. And I just thought, actually, this is what I want to work in. So it's very much a personal choice. And, by no means do I think that working on, molecular issues is not really important and we shouldn't be doing that. But just for me personally, conservation it's something that choices that we are making as humans that are impacting the earth and the ecology of the earth. And of course, the ecology of the earth will be here long after we are here, and it will still exist. But it just felt to me that we need to understand better how we're impacting the planet around us, and we need to make better choices about how can we conserve what we've got around us, or at least conserve the processes that occur around us, and allow nature to have space to do its thing and to support us, because we rely on all those services that it provides. So yeah, that was my kind of entry point into conservation.
Something which I thought would be quite interesting to talk to you about. There are lots of people out there who are better placed than we are to talk about this, but just kind of from a general viewpoint, I was kind of wondering, like, where you see biodiversity and conservation in the bigger scheme of things. Like with all the challenges that humankind faces. It can be environmental, developmental, economic. We've got a whole list of things, right?
Yeah.
Just a very quick anecdote. Sorry, I can repeat the question if I get too far from it. But Georgina Mace, the conservation biologist, she died very recently, actually. Someone asked her where she thought biodiversity belonged in relation to climate change. And she said that she thought that biodiversity was important, but not as important as climate.
It's really difficult to divorce the sort of passion I feel for, almost like I'm a bit of a tree hugger. I will literally, I'll walk past a big beach. I'll be on a walk and I'll see a big beech tree. We might get a 35 or even at the outside 40-meter beech tree just going straight up with the most gorgeous branches, and I just can't help it. I have to give it a hug, and look up and just feel the cool dappled leaves on me, or just looking at dragonflies and just being blown away how they can, in a millisecond, completely reverse direction
and right angles.
Yeah, it was just crazy, just blows my mind. So, it's very personal. Biodiversity means so much to me. Having that, looking at leaves and seeing them as solar panels rather than just these sort of flat green things, thinking about what's going on all around you, this sort of living, breathing organism, almost like this sort of Gaia idea of, this living, breathing earth. And it's really difficult to separate the two, because climate is obviously it's an abiotic physical thing, but it's driven on a local and a global level by biodiversity, and biodiversity is driven by it. So the transpiration rate of plants, over a rainforest, or the huge production of oxygen by phytoplankton in the ocean. There's too much feedback between the two to separate them. So I see them as intimately intertwined, and they're both equally important, really. But yes, of course, a changing climate is going to drive species extinction. On the flip side of that is going to create opportunities for others. I think a big one, and I remember us discussing it as well, is this concept of biological homogenization. My understanding is we live in a time that's actually really biodiverse. Certainly, if going, well, even now, but certainly going back a few hundred years or a few thousand years, we're living in a very biodiverse time. And to preserve the processes that allow that biodiversity to exist, in our lifetime, there will be several species or subspecies of rhino, and perhaps even elephants, God forbid, but even elephants will be telling our kids, well, actually on our watch we let them go, and you can see, they'll be like alongside the dinosaurs, we'll be looking at them saying these once roamed the earth. That to me is it's almost unforgivable.
Yeah.
There's a kind of, I think it's a Buddhist, is it a Buddhist quote? I don't know, I'm just going to completely misquote things. There's something that says there's no good or bad, there's only consequences. And I think sometimes we need to bear that in mind as well. So from an objective standpoint, we are nature. So if you were an alien looking at the world in a speeded up history of the earth, but if you were looking at us, we're just another species that's having big impact on the planet. Ants have a huge impact on the planet. Worms have a huge impact on the planet. The first photosynthesizing cyanobacteria, that introduced oxygen into the atmosphere, wiped out the anaerobic competitors, in what they call is it the Great Oxidation Event? I can't remember the name of it. Over millions of years, where oxygen increased, and basically all the poor anaerobic bacteria were consigned to muddy pools or the insides of our guts. So this is part of change. So is it good? Is it bad? No, but there's a consequence to it. And do we want to? Can we look at ourselves as a species where we have so much power? It's people who are driving conservation problems. It's people who are going to find the solutions, and it's people who are going to be affected by those conservation decisions. So it's all about people. It's all about choices. And so we have that choice.
It's actually quite difficult to separate the ethical and the practical considerations here. So you actually started off talking more about the ethical considerations, or your point of view sounded like more of an ethical point of view, the responsibility for looking after life on Earth. But then that quote that you mentioned was really all about the consequences.
The moral argument is a subjective one. And so therefore it becomes about your moral position almost against somebody else's, who they might say, yeah, of course we don't want to lose this species, but actually in the balance we've got to use this. We want to use this resource because we need it. It's very difficult to tell people what they need or what they don't need. I think you do have to make the case on many levels. So you can make it on a moral level and be totally open about that. We don't want to lose this species because we don't want to lose it, because we love this species. It is fine to say that and put forward the moral argument for trying to avoid any species extinction, or us humans being the main driver of that extinction. But being able to say, actually, this species is also important for an ecosystem that supplies these services, and without which people are going to lose out, and there's this economic shortfall. Of course, the problem with that, of course, it can become just reductionist to the point where only those species or those systems that can provide us with some tangible economic benefit are the ones worth keeping, and that's not that also has is morally problematic. Especially because we actually don't know what benefit they could accrue to us in the future.
Right. Yeah. I guess that my jaded view is that as conservationists, we assume that win-win scenarios are always possible. And they're almost never possible. There's always some trade-off, even if it's a small one. There's always some level of trade-off.
In terms of what I'm saying, there's no good or bad, only consequences. There's a crossover there, isn't there? So that the trade-off is the consequences. You can either have this or this. You can't have both.
So what makes it especially complex is that the trade-off is it's not just spatial; it's temporal as well. The benefit that you get from destruction of nature is usually a relatively short-term one, and the benefit of conserving nature is a more long-term one. That's also what I've just said now is the kind of generic statement that I try to avoid making these days, but it is true to some extent, I think.
I think it's true in many extents, and the one that really strikes home. There's lots of images I have in my head, but a really big one is in the Eastern Cape around Grahamstown and beyond. I used to mountain bike through there, as did you, and you get fields of just scrubland. And you have a look and you just see it's sort of these old woody pineapple fields. And they've been there for a couple of decades now. These fields that are kind of effectively good for nothing. They're not economically productive. They're, in terms of biodiversity, they're pretty rubbish. Yeah, wasteland. And yet what they were not that long ago was that amazing subtropical thicket. And this hugely diverse, massive carbon capture, supporting endemic species, being chopped down to plant pineapples. Now, it's really difficult to argue against that because it's providing food It's providing employment for local people in an area where there's real poverty, and also where there's a history of discrimination against people of colour who were going to be benefiting from those jobs. And so there's lots of seemingly good things. But of course, what happened is that the market shifted and it became cheaper to grow pineapple somewhere else. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know how long it was, but it was less than even a couple of decades of temporary economic benefit for people. Mm-hmm. And then those jobs are now gone, and you're left with a completely trashed environment. And my understanding is that ecosystem doesn't recover particularly quickly due to the nature of the biology of it. And so, it would require a huge restoration effort to get it back to where it was. And, a country like South Africa struggles to find the finances to do that. And, these sort of how do we avoid that kind of environmental destruction for really no social benefit? Some kind of strategic planning on behalf of governments would go a long way to facilitating that. But of course, governments work on 5-year terms in office, etc. So if you can satisfy your job figures in the short term, then you're probably going to do that. So we're talking about things that lots of people have thought about before, but I suppose it does beg the question of, in terms of conservation, looking for win-win situations. Are there any? In southeast England, right, where I'm now sitting, we've got a burgeoning population and there's not enough housing stock. And we live in an area around London, it's called the Green Belt. And although obviously we've been trashing our biodiversity for far longer than even, Southern Africa has, but we do have some really nice little nuggets of, albeit managed. There's nothing pristine about our biodiversity, but some really beautiful, relatively high biodiversity areas, such as chalk streams and some nice, really nice ancient deciduous woodland, etc. But it's interspersed with farmland and golf courses and various other things of relatively low biodiversity areas. But nevertheless, there's a restriction on planning. But we need to build houses. There's just no getting away from it. And so where do we build those houses? Well, what happens is that they find an area and they say, okay, we're going to build 1,000 houses here. And then everyone complains, of course. And then then there's a bit of a barter and they say, okay, right, well, we'll only build 500 houses. But what they don't do is consider what the social amenities are that are needed to support that. They don't consider what the impacts on the environment are in terms of runoff into our chalk streams, or the abstraction from the chalk streams for the water that's required for those people, or even things like infrastructure, what have you. This is a supposedly developed nation that can't even get its act together with town planning. But the thing that strikes me most is that, okay, a lot of people complain about the fact that we might plough up a golf course and knock down a few trees, right, as well in the process. And I think, I don't want them to chop any trees down to build any houses, but that might happen. But wait a minute. When you build a development of 1,000 houses, there's a huge amount of money to be made by somebody, normally the developers, right? And a lot of that will also go to local government. There's a lot of money going around. A tiny amount of that could go to saying, you know what, we're not only going to just replace the biodiversity, these few trees that we've chopped down, this area of trees or whatever, we're actually going to, okay, ancient woodland, that's a different deal. You can't just replace ancient woodland. But what we're going to do is development can be seen as an opportunity to enhance nature in the local area. Yeah, not just like plant some Sitka spruce up in Scotland and say, yes, we've planted an extra 1,000 trees. It could actually work. But the thing is that it's not in the national conversation. It's not, everyone just complains about building houses. It's either you build houses or you don't build houses. It's not like, well, what's the opportunity here? And I think I think so much of conservation should be finding out what's the opportunity in a development, and then saying, okay, your profit margin might suffer a little bit, but how about government stepping up to the plate to actually, facilitate that process as well as having decent laws that, force developers for whatever purpose, building houses or mining or whatever, to bring benefits to nature as well as development. So I'm not saying that's a win-win, because you might cause some environmental destruction, but at least if there's decent planning and laws about how development happens, then I do think that there's a lot of opportunities that we just pass up.
In any situation where there is a trade-off, there is a good way and a bad way, or there's a spectrum of good and bad ways to address those trade-offs.
Yeah.
The absolute extreme would be you either do the one thing or the other thing. Either you maintain the natural area, or you just completely destroy it and build something there. And then there's a whole spectrum of different possibilities in between, different ways of doing things, not just how you spatially arrange them, but how you do them, like you were talking about now. It is always a case of trade-offs, but there are better and worse ways of dealing with those trade-offs.
A lot of it is about vested interests and status quo. Mm-hmm. This is the way we've always done things. And also, large companies or companies who are making money and providing jobs, that's important, but they often have undue influence. Even in a supposedly open democratic society like we're supposed to have in the UK, there's a lot of opaqueness in planning, and also I think it's about conviction of politicians. Sometimes you genuinely hear politicians who have a real conviction about trying to change the way that things are done and making them more open and transparent and inclusive of nature and different sectors of society. But I think often it's about just, politicians, local and national, not really having the conviction and the courage to actually stand up and say, we're going to introduce something quite radical, well, seemingly radical, that maybe doesn't provide the amount of profit that otherwise would be derived from this, but actually in the long term, it will ensure that there's the amenities for people, whether it be roads access or the schools and the doctors' surgeries, etc., that are necessary, but also that we've thought about the sewage and the water supply and the impacts on the local environment and the runoff into the river and all these things. But so much of that just seems to go by the wayside. But just having the conviction to say, we're going to make sure that, we're holding developers to account.
I guess that perhaps the two most important groups of people to communicate messages like this to are, one is the general public, which is most people, and the other is policymakers.
The voters.
Yeah, the voters and the voted for, basically. And I sort of mentioned to you, when I'm doing a YouTube search, I very often see these, you just see the thumbnail of the video of some bizarre looking, obviously photoshopped animal. And it's very often some giant sort of monster-like thing on a beach, or two animals fighting each other, or something absolutely ridiculous.
Oh, yeah.
And then, but the more ridiculous part is the number of views below it. 20 million, 40 million views. Yeah. Relatively recently, you changed to being a science teacher, and now you're teaching science in a high school. So this is kind of a dual. Let me get back to that in a second, but I wanted to just ask the kids that you interact with, are they the kind of people who click on these? Where I'm just kind of wondering, how do we get through to people if that kind of thing is so popular?
I think there is a temptation, and now we can probably classify ourselves as middle-aged men, pretty much.
I guess so.
Sort of approaching 50. In that, I think there is. I constantly need to resist the tendency to do the whole "in my day." We weren't like that, or we were more enlightened, or we didn't behave like that. We were much better. So yeah, I'm going to definitely resist that one. I think that young people are, for the large part, intelligent enough to realize that there is a difference between the kind of, it's just that really is like it's like, why do people watch a boxing match, or why do people watch anything? There's a fascination with sort of fighting and death, and we all have it, right? So it's just some people to a greater or lesser extent, and I think that young people are definitely able to separate what they see there and that kind of thing is purely just fascinating sort of entertainment, sort of almost sort of, there's that horror aspect as well, and separate that from what actually goes on in nature.
And maybe I'm not giving people enough credit now, but I think that very often people click on those because they do actually think it's genuine, and there's a spectrum of them. Some of them are just obviously, to us, as people who know a bit about the natural world, to us are very obviously nonsense. And then there are some that you kind of have to. I'm actually quite tempted to click on them because I'm wondering if just to see if they're true or not, because a few seconds would probably give it away. But my suspicion has been that people are interested in that kind of thing, and I'm thinking about the sort of weird-looking creatures washed up on the beach now as well. That people might be interested in that kind of thing because they think, oh wow, a new, that could be a new species, and look at the size of that thing. They actually think that it could be possible.
I suppose it's like a Loch Ness monster thing. That is fascinating. I mean, if there was even a remote possibility that there could be a plesiosaur living in a deep loch in Scotland, I'd be the first to be sort of get up there and have a look. It'd be absolutely fascinating.
Right.
But I think but I'd be sort of interested in what's the biological process that allowed this thing to evolve or to survive, or how did that happen? I think you do occasionally hear. I remember someone describing on a beach up the west coast of South Africa, someone describing something that they had seen washed up on the beach, and describing it to me like it had hair but they didn't know what it was. It was this mess of something. And I remember just really, really racking my brain, being absolutely fascinated about what this thing could have been, that's been washed up from the deep. Yeah, I suppose if people open it up, then it does show at least that there's an interest in the natural world, even if it's only from a sort of freak perspective.
Yes, yeah.
Just on that, and sort of on the teaching thing, sometimes you can feel a little bit jaded about how uninterested kids can seem in I'll sort of go off on a little anecdote about some beautiful plant or insect or something, and you can see the kids going, oh, and I know I've got about 30 seconds max before I've lost them. But yet they constantly surprise you with what they're fascinated and interested in terms of nature. And I just had one the other day where there was a young lady in my class, and she has not sort of stood out as being someone who is really into biology, right? And yet at the end of the class, I saw her looking at one of the posters, which is on the lab wall, which is of moths and butterflies. And it's quite rare for a student to sort of just hang back. And I said, oh, what are you interested in there? And she said, oh, I was just looking at the vapor moths. And then she started telling me all about vapor moths. She said, oh, no, that's because I saw these moths over there and I could see their eggs. They'd laid eggs around the windows. And I said, oh, yeah, what, around here? She said, yeah, and I saw loads of them. So she'd gone away and researched all about it. And it turns out that the males disperse, find females, mate with them. The females lay eggs, hatch, and then the females only hang around on the food plant and don't fly. And it's just, and she was fascinated by this. And, there's quite a few incidents like that. Someone will want a cutting of one of the plants, for example. I'm like, oh, my goodness, absolutely. Take the cuttings, And then they'll come back for another one. And then they'll tell me about how they've rooted and they've put them in. So, And so, yes, young people are definitely interested in nature. And, you've got kids of your own now, Andre, and I've got a couple of young ladies who are now, 11 and 10. And they are absolutely fascinated, and from a very young age, especially my youngest, she would just sit and watch ants. And this is no influence from me, I really don't think, she was too young. So just like an absolute fascination that there's this sentient being, marching around with 6 legs and going with its little fellows, going backwards and forwards, and just sit there for hours watching it. And then telling me about what, when I come home from work, she'll get very excited to tell me about how the squirrels and the pigeons have been interacting with each other, and, just complete fascination. And all the stories that we tell our children, well, so not all of them, but so many of them about animals, so many of the fairy stories involving animals, so many of the and all the new books, they're all about, okay, it's all anthropomorphizing animals, but it's all about, elephants and tigers and lions and
Disney's empire is based on that entire concept, isn't it? I mean, all the early characters.
And it's not a coincidence. It's because, I mean, if their audience wasn't, okay, you could say that they're manufacturing an interest, but it's not. There's an inherent interest in the natural world and in other beings, and it's definitely there with kids. Absolutely fascinated, and I think as they get older, perhaps a bit more sort of cynical and more interested in other things. But certainly from a young age, it's something that fascinates most kids.
I think also, though, I mean, it's difficult to know without having sampled a big bunch of people. But I think that, at least in my life, there have been certain individuals, and one of them, you mentioned Jenny Day earlier on, who's my aunt. I might as well mention that.
Yes.
And I want to have her on the podcast soon as well, actually.
And I didn't say she was amazing just because she was your aunt. It was she.
I'll definitely leave that bit in, especially for her. But she was definitely a huge influence on me. And I think that part of maybe more than anybody else, actually, my parents were very encouraging of my career towards conservation. They were nature lovers themselves, but they didn't work in the field, whereas Jenny has been a professor all her life. But I think one important thing is it was always kind of a case of providing little bits of detail that I'd sort of grab onto and then want to know more.
Well, yeah, I mean, the thing is, what struck me about being a teacher is that, there's enthusiasm, and obviously subject knowledge is absolutely critical, but there are so many other skills you need in order to be a good teacher, many of which I fail on. But enthusiasm, I know, is not one I'm lacking, but yeah, it's an amazing career, and really one of the main reasons why I chose it, as well as some practical things like being with the kids during the summer holidays, working locally rather than having to commute long distances, etc. So there were definitely sort of family considerations and practical considerations for the career move. But just to have a stable job in the subject that I love is a huge privilege, and to be able to share my passion and interest for all the sciences, not just biology, but in fact I see little distinction between the sciences. Really, they all blend into one another, albeit that physics obviously is the mother science, and then I see sort of increasingly I see biology as just like this crazy wacky branch of organic chemistry. It's just this, it's like organic chemistry gone mad, and that so in a way biology is a kind of niche subject in a way, but obviously the fact that we happen to be living biological organisms is it makes it of particular relevance to us. But yeah, just and then to see students who I've taught choose biology going from GCSE to A level, it might be in spite of me, but at least I haven't put them off. And then hopefully, some of those going on, and you see some of the young people, they're far cleverer than I'll ever be, because when I think of where I was at their age, and just the sharpness of their minds, and where they're definitely future professors, and if they could even look back and think, oh, I remember when Dr. Lowe told me about this anecdote, and that had even a tiny contribution to their inspiration to go and study what they're going to go to go on to study, and to also have a deeper appreciation for the natural world as well. I also run a STEM club, which stands for science, technology, engineering and maths. And so every Thursday I've got the kids normally with nets dipping in ponds and then looking at amoeba and paramecium and what have you under the light, and going around catching insects and then sort of classifying them and talking about their relationship and what they do. And
then there's no curriculum to stick to there either, right? You can kind of do whatever you please.
No, absolutely. I mean, obviously it's always great if you can making links with the curriculum, and there normally is. So there's normally direct links, or at least of indirect links with the curriculum, and that's supporting their learning within the curriculum. But yeah, definitely, I'm not beholden to anything. I mean, the other day we were firing Nerf guns across the sports hall, by putting the Nerf guns at different angles and seeing the distance they travel and all that. So, sort of very basic ballistics, and kids love that stuff. I mean, I remember anything that involved firing anything, I was immediately interested. So really, I just have to think back to what was I interested as a kid, and then I kind of do that with them. And it's almost always, it ticks the boxes.
Yeah.
Something to do with flying, something to do with ballistics, anything to do with creepy crawlies. Yeah.
Actually, that nicely brings me to the one other question I wanted to ask, talking about getting the kids out into nature and stuff. Do you think that people can appreciate and benefit from nature without spending much time in it? Or do you think that, we were talking about influencing young people's views of nature and also just the kind of natural inclination to that? But do you think that it makes a difference if especially young people can spend time in nature and that their minds are kind of changed by that a little bit? Based on your experiences, I don't know if you know enough about the kids' background to be able to say that, but otherwise just your opinions on that would be interesting.
It's difficult to comment in terms of the kids who are in front of me at school. What I do know is that whenever we do something like grab the nets and go and look in the pond or sweep around in some nettles or in some hawthorn bushes or something, and you catch, we caught some bush crickets and even just catching ladybirds and putting them in a pot for a few minutes while they look at them, and just the sheer fascination and exuberance of, because it's difficult to do that unless you've actually got a net. And I would hazard a guess that most kids probably don't have a net. So just having that simple piece of equipment and going out there and actually doing it is clearly of benefit to them. I think, it really deepens their interest in what's out there. Just in, then it's not just a patch of nettles that can sting you. It's full of life, and this looking at the mud at the bottom of the pond, it's full of life. Everywhere you look, it's full of life. And I do think that getting out there and experiencing that can really help. Now, the thing is, if you're growing up in an inner city, you're not going to have that much access to nature. And I think that in terms of the benefits of nature, the easiest way to talk about it is from a personal perspective. As you said, certainly since having kids, I get out into nature less. That's simply because I would have been outside every day in the past, if you remember. Yeah. But now, it is my solace. It's my church. It's my, to get out on the bike or to go for a run or a walk, that is what keeps me sane amongst, all the other competing responsibilities and what have you in life. And talking about, there's been a lot of talk about mental health during the pandemic. Yeah. And it's definitely been just getting out for a walk, getting outside, and has been the panacea almost for everything. But I realize that's me, and that's my N of one. But certainly with my family as well, sometimes it's like pulling teeth just trying to get the kids outside, but it's almost guaranteed that once we're out, everything falls away and everything is fine. And we walk along, we might have been bickering and arguing, and we get outside and everyone's holding hands after 5 minutes and all is fine with the world. But in terms of a more sort of objective perspective, it's difficult to know. I mean, there are loads of studies that show the benefits of nature to people. And I don't have those to hand, but there are certainly lots out there that show that being outside benefits our mental health. I'm personally convinced, although, there's a lot of bad things said about modern technology of social media and what have you. And I do think that, certainly as a teacher, you see it. Young people are spending a huge amount of their time on. Sometimes they spend as much time on social media as they do asleep or at school. And that will take away from time to do other things. For example, going walking and doing physical exercise. But equally, I think that we have to acknowledge the benefits of that as well. And what's this all about, this being in nature and this need for us to talk to each other and communicate with each other? And it's all about connection. And I think it really is about seeing our place and our connection with people around us, and also in our connection with the wider world. And I think that really to have both of those things, to be connected with people and to be connected with nature, it's almost kind of what makes us human.
Okay, if you made it this far, I trust that some of Steve's enthusiasm has rubbed off on you and you're feeling all inspired to go and conserve the environment. Next time, I'll be talking to Sharachandra Lele, a senior fellow at the Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and the Environment in Bangalore. We'll be talking about ecosystem services and related concepts. Sharad has some interesting views on how the concept could be improved. We also talk about the ethics of our relationship with nature and why we conserve it. I find his views really insightful and unusual, and I expect that you will too. I hope to see you then.